Good morning, 5th grade. Today we're going to continue studying about the Great Depression. Before we get started reading, you have a quick write. It says, what images of the Great Depression were the most memorable for you during the gallery walk? Why? Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for the focus question. How did the Great Depression affect life for many Mexican Americans, especially farmers during the 1930s? One of the standard we're going to be working with today is determining one or more main ideas in the text and explaining how they're supported by information in the text. Our vocabulary words today are Great Depression, and that is a deep, long-lasting economic downturn, which means that the economy became really weak and many people lost their jobs. So a lot of people were poor all over the United States. The second word is repatriate, and that's when you send someone back to their home country. Another word for that would be deport. And so this is an example of some of the repatriation that took place in the 1930s. And then the last one is migratory, and that describes a person who moves from place to place to get jobs. So farm workers were often migratory because they had different jobs depending on the season, depending on what was growing. Go ahead and turn the page, and you can go ahead and tear off the back page in your packet so that you have this text out on your desk, Depression and the Struggle for Survival. And as we're reading, we have 4 conclusions that the author makes, and we are looking for evidence to support those conclusions. All right, so number 1 says, collect evidence in the first paragraph to support the claim the Great Depression of the 1930s hit Mexican immigrants especially hard. And we need 2 quotes from the text that prove that Mexican immigrants were hit especially hard in the Great Depression. Let's begin reading paragraph 1. The Great Depression of the 1930s hit Mexican immigrants especially hard. I'm not going to underline that sentence because that's the claim. I want to underline 2 sentences that support this idea. Let's keep reading. Along with the job crisis and food shortages that affected all U.S. workers, Mexicans and Mexican Americans had to face an additional threat, deportation. As unemployment swept the U.S., hostility to immigrant workers grew, and the government began a program of repatriating immigrants to Mexico. Immigrants were offered free train rides to Mexico, and some went voluntarily, but many were either tricked or coerced into repatriation, and some U.S. citizens were deported simply on suspicion of being Mexican. All in all, hundreds of thousands of Mexican immigrants, especially farm workers, were sent out of the country in the 1930s, many of the same workers who had been eagerly recruited a decade before. Okay, so let's think back to this idea that the Great Depression of the 1930s hit Mexican immigrants especially hard. And one of the quotes that I think supports this statement is the second sentence that says, along with the job crisis and food shortages that affected U.S. workers, Mexican Americans had to face an additional threat, deportation. I would underline that sentence and write it in box 1. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for the second quote. Another quote I would choose is the last sentence that says, all in all, hundreds of thousands of Mexican immigrants, especially farm workers, were sent out of the country during the 1930s. Many of them the same workers who had been eagerly recruited a decade before. This shows that Mexican immigrants were hit especially hard because they had to worry about deportation. Write this sentence in the second part of box 1. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for number 2. Number 2 says, collect evidence in the first paragraph to support the claim. The farm workers who remained struggled to survive in desperate conditions. Okay, that should actually be the second paragraph. So we're going to read the second paragraph, and we're going to look for evidence that supports this idea. The Mexican farm workers who remained struggled to survive. Let's read the next paragraph. The farm workers who remained struggled to survive in desperate conditions. Bank foreclosures drove small farms from their land, and large landholders cut back on their permanent workforce. As with many southwestern farm families, a great number of Mexican-American farmers discovered that they had to take on a migratory existence and traveled the highways in search of work. And so, one reason that shows that farm workers struggled to survive was because the bank took many of their farms when they couldn't afford to pay, when the farmers couldn't afford to pay for their land. And if the Mexican Americans worked on large farms, many of the owners fired the workers because they couldn't afford to pay them. So that's one quote we would write in box 2 because it shows that the farm workers were losing their jobs. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for the second quote. The second quote that supports the idea that the farm workers struggled to survive is that this part that says, a great number of Mexican-American farmers discovered they had to take on a migratory existence, meaning they had to move place to place in search of work. All right, we would write that sentence in the second part of box 2. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready to keep reading. All right, we are going to read the next 2 paragraphs, and we want to know, how did the U.S. Farm Security Administration help Mexican farm workers? So we're looking for quotes that tell us the FSA is helping these farm workers who are struggling to survive. Many found temporary stability in the migrant work camps established by the U.S. Farm Security Administration, or FSA. The FSA camps provided housing, food, and medicine for migrant farm families, as well as protection from criminal elements that often took advantage of vulnerable migrants. The FSA set up several camps specifically for Mexican Americans in an attempt to create safe havens from violent attacks. So one way that the FSA helped the migrant farm workers is they set up camps that protected the migrant farm workers. And at the camp, they could get a house, they would have food and medicine, and they'd also have protection from people who are trying to take advantage of them. All right, let's read the next paragraph and find another sentence. You can write this quote down in the first part for box 3. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready to keep reading. The camps also provided an unexpected benefit. In bringing together so many individual farm families, they increased ties with the community. Many residents began organizing their fellow workers around labor issues and helped pave the way for the farm labor movements that emerged later in the century. This interview with a leader of the FSA camp in El Rio, California, describes some of the day-to-day issues the camp residents deal with. All right, and so another way the FSA helped the Mexican farm workers is that it empowered them to organize and to stick up for themselves so that they could get better living conditions and higher pay. So you can write this quote in the second part for box 3. Many residents began organizing their fellow workers around labor issues and helped pave the way for the farm labor movements that emerged later in the century. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for box 4. Alright, it says, collect evidence in the last paragraph to support the claim by the 1930s Mexican Americans were established throughout the American workforce. Although farming was an important source of employment for Mexican immigrants, by the end of the 1930s, Mexican Americans were established throughout the American workforce. Mexican immigrants and their descendants could be found in most of the industries in the Southwest, including ranching and mining. America's growing rail network was particularly important for Mexican immigrants. The railroad industry had long turned to immigrants from Mexico as a source of low-cost labor. In return, Mexican workers found that the railways offered not only employment but also mobility. They often used this relatively inexpensive form of travel to move their families further into the north and east of the U.S. and into a more urban way of life. All right, so we're looking for evidence that says that the Mexican Americans were established throughout the workforce. And one quote I underlined was the quote that talks about how they could be found in industries all across the Southwest, including ranching and mining. And the second quote I found was about the railroad, how the railroad industry had long turned to immigrants from Mexico as a source of low-cost labor. And you can write those two quotes in box 4. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for the paragraph. The paragraph states, how did the Great Depression affect life for many Mexican Americans, especially farmers, in the 1930s? And you can use the claims from your questions as one of your topic sentences and the quotes below to support your answer.